Welcome to Counterpoints Friday. This is our last show before the midterm elections, which we have, of course, been tracking so closely in Sagar and Crystal, and everyone has. But this is the last Counterpoints before the Tuesday midterm elections. Ryan, there's obviously a lot to break down and a lot changing on a daily basis. What do you make of things right now?
Well, last night they dragged Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton out to Manhattan to rally the liberals in New York out to defend Kathy Hochul. So that's not a great sign.
The Wine Mom rally.
If you're struggling in New York, in the New York gubernatorial election heading into the midterm, that doesn't say much about where you are.
Can I say, I actually think they're legitimately struggling in the New York gubernatorial election, and of course, because they're counting on midterm turnout, right? They need to beat Republican turnout in a blue state like New York City, where it's not typically going to be high in a midterm election, by rallying people in Manhattan with, people that Democrats in Manhattan might be inspired by, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, although I'm not sure anybody's particularly inspired by Kamala Harris. That said, Ryan, this is a really instructive case study in what we're kind of breaking down in this block, because frankly, I think what's happening in New York is a good example of how, from a political perspective, Republicans are weaponizing the culture war to great effect, because Democrats, it's not just that Republicans are doing a better than usual job, it's that Democrats are doing a terrible job responding. And part of that is their own fault. I mean, a lot of that is their own fault, because they've kind of locked themselves into ideological prisons that make it very difficult to walk back school lockdowns, to walk back bad crime policy, say that 5 times, and all of these other issues across the board, walk back policies that people don't like in schools when it goes to culture war issues. And I really think New York will be with Crystal and Sagar on election night. That's going to be one of the ones that's on the top of my list to watch, and I never would have predicted that a year ago. And
what's been fascinating is that Republicans, I think, road tested a culture war strategy in Virginia in 2021. I think it worked for them, and I think the media collectively decided not to talk about it.
By the way, by a guy from PE, like a private equity dude in a fleece vest. Road tested that, which from the Republican perspective would be unheard of, right? Like, you're getting a dude from the Carlyle Group to talk about what's in schools, but it's because they were reading the base better.
But they're right, and they're kind of playing. Anyway, so what we want to talk about in this segment is that culture war, because it's this very strange moment where you have one political party that is spending a significant amount of its resources on a particular issue, and yet it's not getting talked about. Like, we know that Republicans are running on inflation. We know that they're running on inflation. We know that they're running on crime. When it comes to the kind of trans school issue, that gets mentioned here or there in the media, but nowhere near the proportion of the amount of time the Republicans are spending on it. And I want to talk about, I think, why that is. But first, let's play this first clip. So this is a very typical ad. This is one hitting Catherine Cortez Masto, who is an incumbent Democratic senator in Nevada, who very well may lose. Let's roll this.
We have an explosion of kids rather suddenly making an announcement that they are transgender.
Democrats like Catherine Cortez Masto, Steve Sisolak, and Joe Biden support policies pushing dangerous transgender drugs and surgeries on kids, taking away parental rights.
We have to go out there and stop this. Our children deserve better.
So after I posted this yesterday, Dave Weigel, who was at the Washington Post, got suspended from the Washington Post, and amid the suspension, I guess, started talking to Semaphore, and he's now national political correspondent for Semaphore. He posted this. If we put up A2, this is Weigel's response here, and basically what he's saying here is, okay, here, I've been covering this a lot for that exact reason. Seems to me that some squeamishness about platforming it with coverage, but leave a TV on in a swing state and all you see is, quote, they want to turn boys into girls ads.
Right.
So you're seeing these ads all over the place, all over the country. They're a big part of the political conversation in the sense that it's going to play a significant role in how voters end up making their decisions. Recently, you started seeing swings among suburban women, for instance. There was a poll that saw what they were saying. They saw an 18-point swing in like the Pittsburgh suburbs away from Democrats.
And by the way, that's like a kind of what Kathy Hochul, since we opened talking about New York, she was up by 19 or so in August, and by this first week of November, that's a very slim margin, if even she's up at all.
And so to Weigel's point about squeamishness, I think there's something to that. In fact, so a campaign source sent me that ad. It said, we're just seeing this absolutely everywhere. These ads like this around the country, and a lot of them targeted at Latino voters. Sources send me these ads. My job is to report on them, post here, and tell people, here, this is what's happening. And I was like, I don't really want to post this.
Yeah.
I was literally squeamish about it.
Yeah.
But I'm like, well, this is my job.
Yeah.
Get over it. Like, so I post a video, tell people like this is what is playing a significant role in these races. And so by not talking about it, I feel like Democrats and also the media allowed Youngkin to kind of road test this strategy in 21, allowed Republicans to test it.
Allowed Republicans to own the narrative.
And own the narrative and see what worked and what didn't work. And now they're just rolling with it in 22 and just without any response at all from Democrats.
Because they don't have a response that's persuasive in a midterm election cycle. And that was on full display when there was a local Michigan elected leader who went viral. And I remember we covered this back at Rising a few months ago. And James Carville marveled at her, and she was responding to the trans debate locally. And it's just not a persuasive argument, no matter how compassionately and how reasonably you try to frame it. People do not buy it. And Republicans allowed Democrats to control the narrative for years and years and years until I think really they saw Trump put cracks in that foundation. And that's where you get a PE guy in a fleece vest like Glenn Youngkin coming in and road testing that message, like you said. And then the year after that, in a midterm cycle, other Republicans are following suit. And that ad, I watched it a couple of times. We were talking before the show, before realizing and sticking around to the very end to see it was done by the American Principles Project. So
who's that?
So it's run by a friend of mine named Terry Schilling. And Terry, for a couple of years, has been running ads like this because other Republicans in the party establishment have been squeamish about it and have
Just
not
freelancing, basically?
Well, like American Principles Project was buying ads in Michigan, I think Kentucky, Wisconsin, in different elections over the last couple of years where national Republicans did not want to touch the trans issue, did not want to touch. Speaking of squeamishness, they have an ad up in Maine against Janet Mills where it's just parents straight up reading excerpts from certain books that Democrats have defended putting in schools up in Maine and showing the squeamishness that parents are experiencing just when they're reading these excerpts and looking at these pictures. And so Terry's been doing this for a couple of years. And it looks like actually other people have learned because to your point, Ryan, I think we even have it here. There's another group, Citizens for Sanity. Citizens for Sanity.
They've been running all these psychotic, xenophobic ads during the World Series and the NLCS. And yeah.
We have one of the Citizens for Sanity ads. We can roll that now.
Left-wing politicians are pushing sexual agendas on our children. X-rated drag shows for kids, pornography in elementary schools. Now they want to charge you with a felony if your school wants you to change your kid's gender and you don't agree. Legally require movie theaters, restaurants, and other businesses to let men use the women's restroom. The radical left has lost their minds, and it's only getting worse. Stop the insanity. Citizens for Sanity paid for this ad.
So what used to be the case is that American Principles Project and maybe some like grassroots conservative groups were the only people willing to make ads like that. And to your point about Republicans road testing it in Virginia and then kind of saying, actually, this looks like it works, coming in.
Why was that? What was holding them back? I don't think of them as kind of...
Okay, so you remember the 2012 Republican autopsy?
Sure.
Famous. I actually keep a copy of it on my desktop in case it ever gets disappeared from the internet. But it was basically coaching Republicans. A lot of folks remember at the RNC under Reince Priebus to move away from the culture war. And
don't be such bigots and jerks. And, yeah.
Okay, that was the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. But see, actually what you just said, I feel like is why there's squeamishness about talking about this.
They don't want to,
And it was like that in the Republican Party very much, because it was they have the trauma from the war on women, the political trauma of the war on women. They have that memory. They never wanted to go in that direction again. They didn't want to get their hands dirty in what they saw as the culture war. Meanwhile, Democrats were, as Obama did, passing things or like his directives on Title IX from his Department of Education that opened the entire country up to what a lot of people are now talking about as radical ideological stuff on LGBT issues. And Republicans let it happen because they didn't want to touch it. They wanted to talk about the economy. They wanted to do tax cuts. They wanted to do their big spending foreign policy, and it was hands off.
And they took a major L on marriage equality.
Took a major L on marriage
and
equality.
looked like real jerks in front of their kids and the whole country, and they felt like they were on the wrong side of history, kind of, at the moment.
There's a lot of, that is a really good point, and there's a lot of memory from that too. That it was handled incorrectly, that a lot of people, even a lot of Republicans now think that was the wrong side of history, and so the squeamishness.
I think they were.
The squeamishness is very much like that exists.
So they were hesitant to dip back into this again.
Yes, very much.
Until they were like, oh wait. And is the expansion of this just in the public space? Does that have something to do with it? Because I think the number of, I think that the salience of the issue has risen, I think, in the last 3-4 years. Like it's just a bigger issue.
Well, I think there's a clear social contagion aspect to a lot of this. But I also think during the pandemic, when parents had this like very direct way of monitoring the curriculum, they were seeing it, hearing it in the kitchen, and you would know that better than I do because you actually have kids, but seeing it during the kitchen while everyone is at home together, it exposed a lot of the curricula. Then there was 2020, which exposed a lot of the curricula because parents were like, wait a second, what's going on? What's being taught? I'm sorry, you're putting the 1619 project in the schools. I don't want my kid reading that. And so I think it was a combination of those things. And I think also, I think Democrats went sort of pedal to the metal in 2020 in a way that got noticed by a lot of Republicans and became sort of that brick wall where even Christine Drazen in Oregon, did you see the ad she was running of Democrats and independents saying, I've never voted Republican in my life? It was very heavily culture war. Obviously, in Oregon, crime is a big issue. It's one of the places where it's obviously very salient. So I think it was just a lot of, and part of that is because when you have this binary formulation where you're either progressive on every single step of the way or you are a bigot, and you wrote about this kind of in your Intercept piece about DEI becoming like sort of a hindrance to progress at progressive organizations, then nobody wants to be the voice of reason and say like, hey, like don't agree all the way on that one.
And when it came to Virginia in 2021, and particularly in Loudoun County, the media narrative was heavily around CRT and a fight over schools and school boards. But there was also, in that area, this massive fight over transgender policy.
Yes.
That Republicans really seized on. And what was your sense of which was a more important issue at the time? Was it, and did CRT kind of become a cover for all of it? And then, so the media talked about CRT, the right talked about CRT, but actually what was going on was more around the transgender fight.
Yeah, we actually did a whole documentary on that at The Federalist where that you can watch it on YouTube. The whole thing is just interviews with different parents that are involved, and it's just them unfiltered in their own words, and we asked them that question. Because I couldn't sort of disentangle those many variables, and what we got over and over again was it's a combination. So when you're mad about COVID, your COVID lockdown, and then you hear about the book, you're going to get involved. You're going to give money to the candidate. You're going to start organizing, and you're going to vote a different way. As opposed to in the past, if you had just been mad about the book, maybe you would have just been mad about the book. Maybe you would have just been mad about the locker room policy. But when you are also mad about the locker room policy, the book, and the COVID, and everyone's locked down, then you really do start to, I mean, that was, the combination of all of those things happening at once was animating for the people in Loudoun County for sure. And that's what they said repeatedly. It was the combo.
And is it the focus on kids that is resonating, you think?
It's just that, really. I mean,
so I'm trying to think what would be the non-transphobic response that Democrats could make to this.
It's a good question. It's a good question.
Because you don't want to, embrace some of the genuine kind of transphobic elements out there that are trying to like smuggle their own agenda through here, through these concerns of the parents. But if they're completely silent on it, then all of that space is just going to be filled by the far right.
If they have if they are unwilling to compromise one bit on this issue, and I don't know what that compromise would look like. I know what I think about this, but I don't know for Democrats, reasonable Democrats, what that compromise would look like. If they're unwilling to even move an inch in that direction because the activist base will hold them all accountable for every millimeter that they go towards that inch, then I think it's just a loss. And I don't know how you can message else on that, because voters, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Independents, they want the compromise position on this. They want the nuanced position on this. And that's not to say that there isn't any legitimate bigotry going on. Of course there is. That always exists and sadly likely always will. But the vast majority of people want a compassionate, compromise situation here that is best for their children. Most people in this country are pro-LGBT. But it's just what they're seeing with children, they view as extremism. And if Democrats can't budge from that, I don't know. I don't know.
And there's a spectrum of ads, like the Citizens for Sanity one that they played there. I think that was just a typically wildly over-the-top, crazy ad like that organization runs. Whereas the other one was more of a typical attack ad. Like you can argue, like I saw a lot of people saying that the ad that I post, for instance, are like, well, that whole thing's inaccurate. It's like, well, actually, if you look at what they're saying, there's a lot of hyperbole and there's a lot of language that you wouldn't use to describe things. But basically what they're saying is that Democrats approve of gender-affirming medical intervention for people under 18.
Yeah.
And they do.
Yeah.
Like that. So that's the basic fight.
Yep.
And Democrats are on one side and Republicans are on the other. And I think Republicans have an enormous amount of polling, and so do Democrats, that show that at least on the polling, it's not going well for them. So what happens if, let's say, there's an upset in Michigan? Because
Tudor Dixon.
Yeah, could she win? What do you think?
Yeah, I think Tudor Dixon.
And if she wins,
it depends on the size of the weight.
That's a race, for instance, that has heavily been fought over these issues.
Yes. I mean, the parents in Dearborn, which we reported on a couple of weeks ago, could swing that election to Tudor Dixon. That's not a bloc that ever votes Republican in any large numbers whatsoever, but could be so animated talking about turnout in a midterm cycle. Those are the folks that could be so animated that they wouldn't normally vote, let alone vote Republican, and they're going to. And actually, I reached out to Terry Schilling from American Principles Project after you sent me the ad and said we were going to be covering this, and he sent a statement that said, the big story around these ads is that Democrats have lost their minds when it comes to children and families, and establishment Republicans are committing political malpractice by not leaning into these issues. Talk to an average voting parent, and protecting kids from this Democrat Party-led insanity is front of mind, along with inflation and crime. The new crop of GOP candidates understands this. How long before the party committees pick it up? So what he's saying is interesting because it leaves room for even more messaging on this in the future, and that it makes the stakes for Democrats. It increases the stakes for Democrats to come up with a good answer.
Yeah. And what I would say for people on the left is that there has, for a long time, last couple of years in activist circles, been a phrase that goes roughly like, your intent doesn't matter.
Yeah, right.
What matters is outcomes. And that's usually used at somebody who says, I didn't mean to say something bigoted. Well, it doesn't matter what your intent was. You did say it, so you're guilty of this. If outcome is what matters, not intent, and the outcome is that the far right wins in Michigan and wins in all of these, and wins in Nevada and takes over the Senate, takes over the House, then your intent doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just before we leave, I want to commend to everybody a piece on Ben Dominich's Substack called The Transom, and he wrote about it in the in the Spectator US as well. He talks about the kitchen table versus the kitchen tablet, and it's sort of a new spin on the fact that we live in two countries, right? Which is a cliche that is used in different ways and in different contexts, but in this context, I thought made a lot of sense that if you're, an average parent who doesn't have time to spend on social media, you're experiencing a very different version of America where, if you're on social media, versus if you're not on social media. This is a different, and the people who are on social media disproportionately are running campaigns and media outlets, et cetera, et cetera. So
cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.